Sign it, and you lose everything. The words didn't belong in that room, and that was exactly why every sound stopped the second they landed. The long glass table reflected a dozen stunned faces, suits frozen mid-motion, fingers hovering over tablets, pens suspended just above paper. At the far end, Daniel Whitmore, CEO of Whitmore Holdings, sat with his pen poised inches above a contract worth over $80 million, the faint hum of the air conditioning the only thing still moving in the room. Slowly, almost reluctantly, his eyes lifted. Not toward a board member, not toward his legal team, but toward the side of the room, where no one important ever stood. Ava Williams didn't step forward. She didn't need to. She stood beside the wall, one hand still gripping a folded microfiber cloth, the faint scent of cleaning solution clinging to her sleeves, her badge turned slightly inward, as if even the plastic itself had learned to stay invisible. Her heart was pounding, hard enough she could feel it in her throat, but her voice, when it came again, didn't shake. Page 14, she said quietly, her eyes fixed not on him, but on the contract. Subsection C. It shifts liability, not shared, entirely onto your company. A chair creaked somewhere to the left. Someone let out a short, disbelieving breath. Daniel's brow tightened, not in concern, but in irritation, the kind reserved for interruptions he didn't authorize. Excuse me. His voice was calm, controlled, but sharpened at the edges, like a blade drawn halfway. Ava didn't move. The overhead lights cast a pale glow across the polished floor, catching the faint scuff marks near her shoes, the kind no one else ever noticed. It's written to sound protective, she continued, each word measured, deliberate. But it's not. It's a trap. A few executives exchanged glances, subtle at first, then less so. One man leaned closer to his copy of the document, flipping pages with quick, nervous precision. Another tapped his tablet, scrolling faster than before. But Daniel didn't look down. Not yet. He leaned back slightly in his chair, the leather creaking under the shift, his gaze narrowing as if trying to decide whether she was worth acknowledging at all. And you are? He asked, not because he didn't know, but because the question itself placed her exactly where he believed she belonged. Ava inhaled slowly, steadying the rise and fall of her chest. I work nights, she said. Maintenance. A pause. Then, softer, but firmer, but I read. A ripple moved through the room. Not loud, not dramatic, but enough. Enough to break the perfect control that had existed seconds before. Daniel's fingers tightened slightly around his pen. For just a fraction of a second, something shifted behind his eyes. Not belief, not yet, but the smallest fracture in certainty. Still, he didn't look at the contract. Instead, he studied her, as if trying to measure the distance between who she was supposed to be and what she had just done. The silence stretched. Heavy, uncomfortable. And somewhere in that stillness, the deal, once so certain, no longer felt untouchable. The room did not move, but something inside it had already begun to shift, subtle as a hairline crack beneath polished marble, the kind no one notices until the weight becomes too much to ignore, and Ava could feel it even from where she stood, pressed against the edge of a world that was never built for her, the cold air brushing against her skin, carrying the faint scent of leather chairs and expensive cologne, a space where voices like hers were not meant to rise above a whisper, and yet she had spoken, and now there was no way to take it back, no way to step quietly out and return to the rhythm of mopping floors and emptying trash bins, as if she had never crossed that invisible line. 8 hours earlier, the building had been different, quieter in a way that felt almost honest, the top floors dimmed under after-hours lighting, the city outside glowing through the tall windows like a distant constellation. And Ava had moved through the hallways with practiced precision, her cart rolling softly across the carpet, each movement efficient, invisible, learned over years of watching her mother do the same in places just like this, places where people looked through you rather than at you, where presence meant silence, and silence meant safety. She had not been looking for anything that night. Not answers, not trouble, just another shift, another paycheck, another step forward in a life that demanded more patience than it ever gave back. But then there was the folder, left, half open on the edge of the copier tray, thick, stamped, important in a way that made most people instinctively look away, but Ava had never been. Most people. And something about the way the pages were misaligned, the way one corner curled slightly upward as if it had been handled in a hurry, pulled her in. She had hesitated, just for a second, her fingers hovering above the paper, the faint hum of the machine filling the silence. And then she opened it, slowly, carefully, her eyes scanning lines of language that most would dismiss as too dense, too technical, too far removed from their world. But for Ava, it was not foreign, it was familiar, because while others spent their nights scrolling through distractions, she spent hers reading, studying, teaching herself the patterns behind contracts, the quiet ways power hides inside words, the places where meaning shifts just enough to change everything. And that was when she saw it, buried deep within the text, not obvious, not loud, but precise, intentional. A single clause that tilted the entire agreement in one direction, transferring risk so completely that it would leave one side exposed without even realizing it. She had read it twice, then a third time, her pulse quickening as understanding settled in, and she remembered standing there under the fluorescent light, the paper trembling slightly in her hands, knowing exactly what it meant, and also knowing exactly what she was not supposed to do with that knowledge. Because people like her were not meant to interfere, not meant to speak, not meant to exist anywhere near decisions like the one being made upstairs. And yet now, standing in that room, under brighter lights, surrounded by people who had never once imagined she might understand what they did, she held that same knowledge steady inside her, her breathing controlled, her posture still, her voice already spoken. And across the table, Daniel Whitmore finally lowered his gaze to the document. Just a fraction, just enough to acknowledge that something in this room had changed, even if he was not ready to admit what it was. Daniel Whitmore did not rush, and that was what made the room lean toward him without realizing it, because everything about him suggested control measured in seconds and silence rather than noise. And as his eyes finally dropped to the contract, the movement was so small it almost felt imagined, but every person seated at that table felt it. The shift of gravity when the most powerful man in the room chose to acknowledge something he had just been prepared to dismiss. He flipped the page once, slow, deliberate, the faint whisper of paper cutting through the tension, his thumb stopping exactly where Ava had pointed, and for a moment, nothing happened, no reaction, no visible change, just his gaze scanning line after line with the same precision that had built his company from a mid-sized firm into a multi-billion-dollar force. And yet beneath that stillness, something subtle began to fracture, because Daniel was not a careless man, and he was not used to being wrong. Across from him, one of the senior partners cleared his throat softly, adjusting his tie as if the fabric had suddenly grown tighter, while another executive leaned closer, pretending to review his notes, but clearly watching Daniel's face instead, searching for any sign, any indication of what came next, because in rooms like this, truth did not matter until power decided it did. Ava remained where she was, her fingers still wrapped around the cloth, the texture rough against her skin, grounding her in a moment that felt suspended between consequence and possibility. And she did not look at Daniel now, not because she was afraid, but because she had already said what needed to be said, and anything more would only give them reason to reduce her words into something smaller than what they were. The silence stretched again, heavier this time, layered with uncertainty, until Daniel's pen lowered slightly, not to sign, but to rest against the paper, a pause that should not have meant anything, yet somehow meant everything. And then, finally, he spoke, his voice quieter than before, but sharper, more focused. Who drafted this section? And the question did not carry anger, not yet, but it carried attention, the kind that forced people to sit straighter, to reconsider what they thought they understood. A man near the center of the table shifted uncomfortably, glancing toward the legal team, while another reached for a glass of water, the faint clink of ice sounding louder than it should have. And still, Daniel did not look up, his eyes locked on the text as if trying to map every implication, every hidden turn of language that might have slipped past his team. And in that moment, the room began to change, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the quiet way. Power reorients itself when certainty gives way to doubt, when confidence is forced to share space with the possibility of error. And then, as if the tension had reached just enough weight to tip forward, Daniel's gaze lifted again, slower this time, more deliberate, and when it landed in Ava's direction, it no longer carried dismissal. It carried something else, something sharper, something searching. As if for the first time he was not looking past her, but directly at her, measuring not her position in the room, but the truth of what she had seen before anyone else had even thought to look. The question did not echo loudly, but it landed with weight, the kind that pressed into the room and made every person suddenly aware of their own position, their own responsibility, and no one answered right away, not because they did not hear it, but because they understood exactly what it meant. And across the table, the legal team shifted almost in unison, eyes flickering between one another in silent calculation, searching for the safest response in a moment that no longer felt controlled. Daniel Whitmore remained still, his posture unchanged, but his presence sharpened. The calm authority he carried now focused into something more precise, more dangerous, because it was no longer about closing a deal. It was about understanding how close he had come to stepping into something irreversible. "I asked a question," he said again, quieter this time, but with a clarity that cut through hesitation, and finally, one of the senior attorneys leaned forward, adjusting his glasses, his voice careful, measured. "The clause was reviewed by our external consultants and cleared through compliance," he said, choosing each word like it might be examined later, which now it very well could be. Daniel's gaze did not leave the page as he responded. Reviewed is not the same as understood, and that was when the room shifted again, more noticeably this time, because the certainty that had filled the space earlier had begun to dissolve, replaced by something colder, something uncertain. Ava felt it from across the room. Not as a victory, not yet, but as a change in direction, a subtle turning of momentum that she had set into motion the moment she chose to speak. And still, she did not move, did not step forward, did not try to explain further, because she understood something the others did not, that truth, when it is real, does not need to be forced, it only needs space. Daniel's finger traced a single line of text, slowly, deliberately, as if mapping the structure beneath the language, and then he paused, the smallest hesitation, but enough to confirm that what Ava had seen was not imagination, not overreach, but something real, something hidden in plain sight. And for the first time since the meeting began, Daniel leaned back in his chair not as a sign of control, but as a sign of reconsideration. The pen in his hand lowered fully to the table, the soft tap barely audible, yet it carried through the room like a signal, because everyone knew what it meant. He was not signing, not yet, and that single decision created a ripple that moved through every person present, forcing them to adjust, to rethink, to question what they had already accepted. "Walk me through it," Daniel said suddenly, and this time, he was not speaking to his legal team. He was not addressing the consultants or the executives who had spent weeks preparing this agreement. His eyes had shifted, steady now, focused, and they landed directly on Ava. The air seemed to tighten around her, not with hostility, but with expectation, something heavier, something unfamiliar, because this was not dismissal, this was invitation, and yet it was also risk, because stepping forward meant stepping fully into a space that had never been meant for her. For a brief second, Ava felt the weight of every reason she should stay where she was, every rule she had learned about silence and survival. But beneath that, stronger, steadier, was something else, something that had brought her into this moment in the first place. And slowly, she took a step forward, the soft sound of her shoes against the floor marking a boundary crossed, not loudly, not dramatically, but undeniably. And as she moved closer to the table, the distance between who she was supposed to be and what she was becoming narrowed with each step, until she stood just within the edge of their world, not as someone who belonged, but as someone who could no longer be ignored. The distance between the table and where Ava had been standing was no more than 10 feet, but it felt longer, stretched by every eye now fixed on her, by every silent judgment forming in a room that was no longer sure what to make of her presence. And as she stepped closer, the sound of her movement, soft, measured, seemed louder than it should have been, each step marking a quiet defiance of the role she had been expected to remain in. She stopped at the edge of the table, not sitting, not reaching for anything that was not hers, her hands still at her sides. the cloth now folded neatly between her fingers as if it were the only thing tethering her to the world she came from. And for a brief moment, no one spoke, because no one had prepared for this version of events. No one had rehearsed what it meant to be corrected by someone they had already decided did not belong. Daniel Whitmore watched her closely, not with impatience, but with a focus that had sharpened into something almost analytical, as if he were trying to understand not just what she saw, but how she saw it. And when she finally spoke, her voice was calm, steady, not raised to command the room, but clear enough that it did not need to be. "It is structured to look like a standard risk allocation," she said, her eyes moving briefly to the page, then back up, not avoiding anyone, not challenging them either, just stating what was there. "But the language in subsection C overrides the earlier protections. It shifts all post-merger liability to your company if there is any dispute, any compliance issue, anything at all." And as she spoke, a few heads turned again toward their documents, pages flipping faster now, the quiet rustle building into something more urgent. One of the executives leaned forward, frowning, tracing the lines with his finger as if trying to catch up to a conversation that had already moved past him, while another whispered something under his breath, too low to fully hear, but enough to carry a tone of disbelief. Ava did not rush, did not fill the silence with unnecessary explanation. She let the words settle, let the structure reveal itself, because she understood that once seen, it could not be unseen. "It is not a shared clause," she added, softer now, but more precise. "It is a transfer, complete and one-sided." And that was when the shift became undeniable, when the room could no longer hold onto the version of reality it had entered with, because now the evidence was in front of them, not hidden, not theoretical, but present in ink and language that suddenly felt heavier than before. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger directed at her, but in recognition of something deeper, something closer to miscalculation, and he leaned forward again, his hand resting on the table, his fingers tapping once, lightly, as if marking the exact point where control had slipped, even if only for a moment. Across the table, the senior attorney cleared his throat again, this time less steady. "This interpretation is unconventional," he said, the hesitation in his voice betraying the uncertainty he was trying to mask, and a few quiet nods followed, subtle, almost reflexive, as if agreement could restore order. Ava did not respond immediately. She did not defend herself or push back. She simply stood there, grounded, present, allowing the weight of what she had said to carry itself. And in that stillness, something became clear, not just to Daniel, but to everyone watching, that this was not guesswork, not overconfidence, but understanding, quiet and precise, the kind that does not need permission to exist. And yet, even as that realization began to take hold, the room resisted, because acceptance meant admitting that they had missed something, that the hierarchy they trusted had failed them. And in that resistance, the tension returned, sharper now, pressing against the edges of the moment, waiting to see whether truth would be acknowledged or pushed aside. The room did not argue, not immediately, but the resistance did not disappear either. It settled into the space like a quiet pressure, the kind that builds behind composed faces and carefully chosen words. And for a few seconds, no one moved, no one spoke, as if everyone was waiting for someone else to decide what this moment meant, because acknowledging her would mean something had already gone wrong. The overhead lights reflected sharply across the glass table, catching the edges of documents, now slightly out of place. Pages no longer aligned the way they had been at the start of the meeting, and that small disruption mirrored something larger, something no one could quite put back into order. Daniel Whitmore sat still, his eyes no longer scanning quickly, but fixed, deliberate, as if he were slowing everything down on purpose, forcing himself to see what had almost been missed. And in that stillness, the sound of the city far below became faintly noticeable through the windows, distant traffic, a muted rhythm of life continuing outside a room that had suddenly become too quiet. Ava remained standing, her posture unchanged, her breathing steady, not because the moment was easy, but because she had already passed the point where fear could send her back, and now there was only the truth she had seen, and the choice she had already made to speak it. One of the executives shifted in his seat, the leather chair giving a soft creak, and he leaned toward Daniel slightly, lowering his voice just enough to suggest caution. "We can revisit the clause after signing," he said, the words smooth, practiced, an attempt to restore momentum, to move forward before doubt could fully take hold. Another voice followed, quieter, more hesitant. "It is standard language in some agreements," as if repetition alone could make it safe again. But Daniel did not respond right away, his hand resting flat against the table now, fingers spread slightly, as if grounding himself in the moment. And the silence that followed was not empty. It was heavy, layered with calculation, memory, and a growing realization of how close he had come to making a decision based on incomplete understanding. Ava felt that shift, not as something visible, but as something that changed the air itself, the way people breathed, the way they looked at the page, the way no one was quite as certain as they had been before. She did not speak again, did not repeat herself, because she understood that this part did not belong to her anymore. The moment had moved beyond explanation into something deeper, something that required the person with power to decide whether truth mattered more than pride. The seconds stretched, long enough that even the smallest sounds became noticeable, the faint tap of a finger against glass, the quiet exhale of someone holding their breath too long, the distant hum of electricity running through the building. And in the middle of it all, Daniel finally lifted his pen again, not with urgency, not with confidence, but with intention, and for a brief moment, it hovered above the signature line once more, the same position as before, but now carrying an entirely different weight. Ava's eyes did not move to the pen. She kept her gaze steady, not watching for the outcome, because she already understood something the others were still learning, that the decision in front of him was no longer just about a contract. It was about whether he would choose to see what had been placed in front of him, or choose to ignore it and continue as if nothing had changed. And in that quiet, suspended second, the entire room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for a single motion to determine everything that came next. The pen did not fall, and that alone was enough to fracture whatever illusion of certainty had been holding the room together, because Daniel Whitmore, a man known for decisive action, for signatures that came without hesitation, now held still in a way no one in that room had ever seen before, his hand hovering above the paper not out of doubt alone, but out of recognition. Recognition that something fundamental had shifted beneath him. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, he lowered the pen away from the signature line and placed it down on the table with a soft, controlled motion, and the sound, though quiet, landed heavier than any spoken word, because it was the sound of a decision not made, of a path deliberately stepped away from. A subtle ripple moved through the room, chairs adjusting, shoulders tightening. A few glances exchanged too quickly to be hidden, and across the table, one of the senior executives exhaled under his breath, the tension in his posture breaking just slightly, while another leaned back, eyes narrowing as if recalculating everything he thought he understood about the deal they had been seconds away from finalizing. Daniel did not look at them, not yet. His gaze remained on the contract for a moment longer, tracing the same lines Ava had pointed out, but this time not as a test, not as a challenge, but as confirmation. And when he finally lifted his head, the expression on his face had changed, not dramatically, not with visible emotion, but in a way that could be felt rather than seen. The quiet certainty replaced with something more grounded, more aware. "We are not signing this today," he said, his voice even, controlled, but carrying a weight that settled the room instantly. And there was no argument, no immediate pushback. Because the authority behind those words did not invite it. It ended the conversation before it could begin. A pause followed, not empty, but full of realization, and then he added, more quietly, "There is a structural imbalance in this agreement that was not properly addressed." And the phrasing was deliberate, careful, not assigning blame yet, but making one thing clear: something had been missed, and it mattered. Across the table, the senior attorney nodded slowly, though the movement lacked confidence, and another member of the legal team shifted uncomfortably, flipping through pages as if searching for something that might restore control. But the moment had already moved beyond that, beyond explanations and justifications. Daniel's gaze shifted then, not broadly, not across the room, but directly, precisely, until it landed on Ava again, and this time, there was no trace of dismissal, no question of her presence, only acknowledgement, sharp and unmistakable, for a brief second. The room seemed to narrow around that line of sight, everything else fading into the background, the executives, the documents, the polished surfaces, all secondary to the simple fact that the person who had been least visible minutes ago had just altered the course of a multi-million-dollar decision. Ava did not react outwardly. Her posture remained steady, her expression unchanged, but inside, she felt the shift fully now, not as validation, but as a quiet confirmation that truth, when spoken clearly enough, could not be undone, no matter where it came from. Daniel reached for the contract again, not to sign, but to close it, the pages aligning neatly as he set it aside. A final, deliberate motion that marked the end of what had once seemed inevitable, and as he did, the room exhaled collectively, the tension releasing in a way that left behind something different, something quieter, something more aware. And in that silence, one truth settled deeper than any words that had been spoken. That power, for all its certainty, had paused, had listened, and had changed direction, not because it was forced to, but because it had finally seen what had been there all along. No one moved to leave, even though the meeting was, by all formal definitions, over, because something unfinished still lingered in the air, something that did not belong to contracts or numbers, but to the quiet weight of what had just happened. And Daniel Whitmore remained seated for a moment longer than necessary, his gaze resting not on the executives, not on the legal team, but on the space where certainty had once been, as if recalibrating something internal, something deeper than a business decision. Then, without announcement, he stood, the movement smooth, controlled, but carrying a different energy than before, less about authority, more about intention. And as he stepped away from his chair, the room subtly adjusted around him, people, straightening, watching, waiting, unsure whether the moment had truly passed or was about to shift again. Ava had already begun to step back, instinct guiding her toward the edges once more, toward the place she understood, the place where she would not disrupt anything further, her hand tightening slightly around the cloth as if preparing to disappear back into routine, back into the quiet rhythm of work that asked nothing from her except presence without voice. "Miss Williams," Daniel said, and the words stopped her before she could take another step, not because they were loud, but because they were precise, directed, intentional, and for a brief second, the room held its breath again, not in tension this time, but in attention. Ava turned slowly, her posture steady, her expression unchanged, but her eyes met his directly now, without hesitation, without apology. Daniel took a step closer, not enough to close the distance entirely, but enough to shift the dynamic, enough to make it clear that this was no longer a moment happening around her, but one that included her fully. "You saw something that my entire team did not," he said, his voice calm, measured, but carrying a weight that made every word land, and there was no defensiveness in it, no attempt to diminish what had happened, only acknowledgement, direct and unfiltered. A faint silence followed, not uncomfortable, but reflective, and then he continued, "That does not happen by accident." And the statement hung there, simple, but undeniable, because it reframed everything, not as interruption, not as disruption, but as value, as clarity. Ava did not rush to respond. She did not lower her gaze or shift her stance. She simply stood there, present in a way she had not been allowed to be before, and when she spoke, her voice remained the same as it had been from the beginning, steady, grounded. "I just read what was there," she said, and the humility in her words did not diminish their impact. It sharpened it, because it made the truth even clearer, that what had been missed was not hidden beyond reach. It had simply been overlooked. Daniel studied her for a moment longer, not as a CEO evaluating an employee, but as a man recognizing something real, something that did not fit neatly into titles or positions. And then he nodded once, small, but deliberate, a gesture that carried more meaning than any formal acknowledgement could. "We are going to review every line again," he said, turning slightly toward the table, but his attention did not fully leave her. "And I would like you to be part of that process." And the words settled into the room with quiet force, because they did more than recognize her. They repositioned her, not at the edges, not in the background, but within the center of something that had once excluded her completely. A few subtle reactions moved through the executives, brief glances, restrained shifts, but no one spoke against it, because the moment had already defined itself, and Daniel had made his decision clear. Ava felt the weight of that invitation, not as pressure, but as something unfamiliar, something that required her to step forward in a way that went beyond a single moment of truth. And for a brief second, she allowed herself to feel it, the distance she had crossed, the space she now occupied. And then she gave a small nod, not dramatic, not exaggerated, just enough to acknowledge what had been offered. And in that quiet exchange, something larger settled into place, not a victory, not a conclusion, but a shift, steady and irreversible, where recognition replaced dismissal, and where a voice that had once been ignored was now impossible to overlook. The room emptied slowly, not with the usual rush of schedules and next meetings, but with a quieter pace, as if everyone who stepped out carried a piece of what had just happened with them, something they could not quite explain, but could not ignore either. And the long glass table that had once reflected confidence now held only scattered documents and the faint imprint of decisions not made. Ava stood for a moment after the others had begun to leave, her hand resting lightly at her side. The folded cloth still there, still familiar. A small reminder of where she had been just an hour ago, before everything shifted, and through the tall windows, the late afternoon light had softened, casting long reflections across the floor, turning the sharp edges of the room into something quieter, something less certain. Daniel Whitmore remained near the head of the table, not seated anymore, not surrounded by voices or advisors, just standing in a space that had finally grown still. And for a brief moment, he did not speak, he simply looked at the contract resting closed in front of him, as if measuring the distance between what almost happened and what did not, the thin line that had separated certainty from consequence. Ava turned slightly, ready to step away, to return to the hallway, to the rhythm she understood, but something in the stillness held her there, not as an obligation, but as a pause, a moment that had not fully finished yet. "Miss Williams," Daniel said again, quieter this time, without the weight of an audience. And when she looked back, the difference was clear, not in his position, but in his presence, something less guarded, more aware. He took a step toward the table and picked up a single sheet of paper, not the contract, but something else, a clean page, and he placed it carefully where she could see it, not pushing it toward her, not insisting, just setting it there. "Opportunities are not always announced," he said, his voice steady, reflective. "Sometimes they arrive as moments, and what we choose to do in those moments decides everything that follows." And he did not frame it as an offer, not yet, not with titles or promises, because this was not about position, it was about recognition. Ava stepped closer, just enough to see the paper clearly, the edges crisp, untouched, and for a second, she did not reach for it. She simply looked, taking in what was being placed in front of her, not as something given, but as something opened. The light shifted again, softer now, catching in the reflection of the glass, and in that quiet, there were no voices, no pressure, no expectations spoken out loud, only the space between them and the understanding that had formed without needing to be explained. Ava's fingers loosened slightly around the cloth, and slowly, almost unconsciously, she set it down on the edge of the table, a small, simple motion, but one that marked a transition more clearly than any words could have, from where she had stood before to where she now had the choice to stand. She looked up once more, meeting Daniel's gaze, not seeking approval, not asking permission, just acknowledging the moment for what it was. And then her hand moved, steady, deliberate, toward the paper, not rushing, not hesitating, simply moving forward. Outside, the city continued as it always did, traffic flowing, people moving, unaware of the quiet shift that had taken place high above. But inside that room, something had settled into place, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a certainty that did not need to announce itself, the kind that lives in stillness, in choices, in the space between what was expected and what became real. And as the light faded slightly against the glass, the silence that remained was no longer empty. It was complete.